Welcome to A Novel Talk. I'm Wendy Kendall, a cozy mystery author. My book, Cat Out of the Bag, about Catherine Watson, an international purse designer and amateur sleuth, will be available in April. I'm half of the duo, bringing you our regular podcast series, talking with fascinating novelists who are writing across a variety of genres. And here is your co-host.
Hi, my name is Carl, and I write cozy mysteries. No, that's what Wendy writes. I write paranormal fantasy, and I don't have an upcoming book.
Yet.
Yet.
Well, join us today for a novel talk with Erica Miner. Violinist turned author, Erica Miner has had a multifaceted, award-winning career. A native of Detroit, she studied violin with Boston Symphony Orchestra concertmaster Joseph Silverstein at Boston University, where she graduated cum laude. The New England Conservatory of Music, and the Tanglewood Music Center, summer home of the Boston Symphony, where she performed with such celebrated conductors as Leonard Bernstein and Eric Leinsdorf. Erica went on to perform with the prestigious Metropolitan Opera Company for 21 years, where she worked closely with renowned maestro James Levine. Now a well-recognized reviewer for Seattle Opera and San Diego Opera, as well as San Diego Symphony, Seattle Symphony, and Pacific Northwest Ballet. Erica is a regular contributor of articles, reviews, and interviews to a variety of magazines and journals. Screenplay writer and novelist, Erica has written 4 novels, including 2 in her murder mystery series with her publisher Twilight Times Books, where there's a synergy of books and readers' imaginations. On that novel note, welcome to A Novel Talk, Erica Miner.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Carl. I just wanted to begin by saying I love opera. Opera is fantastic. Opera is fun. Opera can also kill you, but more about that later. I worked at the Met for 21 years, and while I was there were a number of nefarious things going on and difficult people to work with. For example, take the orchestra. The way I describe the Met Orchestra is 100 neurotic musicians thrown together in a hole in the ground with no light and no air, 7 days a week, days, nights, and weekends. You see more of these people than you see of your own families. Sooner or later, someone's going to want to kill someone in the pit. So that's how it all started. All of this activity, whether good, bad, or nefarious, inspired me to write my novels, my operatic mystery series. I figured that was a way I could kill off all the people who made my life miserable. And, well, it took off from there.
Well, we'll try not to make your life miserable right now, Erica. I don't want to be in your third novel that way.
Not that way.
The setting for your second book in your murder mystery series is the Opera House in Santa Fe, New Mexico. What a beautiful and rugged part of the country to choose as a background. It's so rich in history and native culture too, which you weave so expertly into the story Death by Opera. What inspired you to set this story there?
Well, actually, it all started out with one of my Murder in the Pit readers who was asking me about a sequel, and I hadn't really thought about it or where I wanted to set it, and he said, you absolutely have to set it at Santa Fe Opera. Santa Fe Opera is unique, and it has such an exotic and mysterious atmosphere. And so I thought about what I knew about Santa Fe. I certainly had known a lot of singers who sang at Santa Fe Opera, so I started doing some research. And I found that it seemed like the perfect atmosphere for a mystery. There you have an opera house in the middle of the desert, surrounded by mysterious mountain ranges, one of which is actually called Sangre de Cristo, or Blood of Christ. You have an opera house which has a natural backdrop behind it as well, where you're surrounded by mountains on both sides. And when they open up the backdrop, you can actually, while the performances are going on, you can see the kind of landscape of New Mexico. So it seemed like the perfect place to set an opera. This opera house also is open to the elements. It does have a roof over the main part of it. However, the first time it was built, the middle part of the house was completely at the beck and call of nature. And with the crazy weather patterns in Santa Fe, you can imagine some of the disasters they had. I knew a singer once who told me a lot of stories about his experiences at Santa Fe Opera. And he said weather actually had quite an effect. One evening in a performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni, there's a scene where one of the characters who's murdered early in the opera comes back as a statue that has come to life, called the Commendatore. But literally, at the moment that this terrifying moment that this statue comes out on stage, there was a huge clap of thunder and a bolt of lightning. I mean, it could not have been timed better. That's the kind of thing that happens at Santa Fe. So how could I resist setting Death by Opera there?
Wow.
And the desert is beautiful too.
It is.
I love all the local flavor that you added to the story, like how that detective covers everything in chilies. I have a friend from New Mexico, and she has friends ship chilies from home up here so that she can have them in Seattle. In your writing, you bring the state, the region to the life, showing the readers the experience through all of the senses. As an author, what is your process for bringing this vivid presence to the story?
Well, Carl, I think the first thing to think about is how much do you know about the place itself? I had only been there once, so what that entailed was going there and kind of taking in the atmosphere, meeting the people, absorbing the local color, going to museums and restaurants, and asking everybody lots of questions. Also, because of Santa Fe's rich history, which is another reason why it makes a great atmosphere for this mysterious novel, there's so much to research. So between the research that I did at home and then going there a couple of times and just taking the atmosphere, finding out how things go on, all of that kind of thing is what I drew upon to create this atmosphere and the presence of the story. Incidentally, while I was there, among the people that I met, I had some friends, which I'll talk about that later, some friends at the opera company. But in just walking around Santa Fe and watching the people and how they interact, I happened to, by chance, meet a guy who was part of the Navajo tribe, which, of course, between the Spanish history and the Native American presence, those are two of the most important, shall I say, considerations of the atmosphere of New Mexico. So I actually had a chance to sit down with this guy who was there because his tribe always comes in and sells their wares in the main square of Santa Fe. So I had this wonderful talk with him, and he told me so much about the rich culture and rich history of the various tribes, of course, mostly the Navajo. And that gave me a kind of insight that I could then sprinkle in to the book and to the plot. And so it's that kind of thing, being there, observing what goes on, speaking with the people, and just taking in the atmosphere. That's, to me, the most important thing for making it real and making it vivid, I think.
Well done. You achieved that. And since we are talking about the beautiful Santa Fe desert. I'd like to learn more about the spiritual journey that Julia took as a paranormal writer. It was very interesting to me. Specifically, her vision quest. Have you ever gone on one?
I actually did, but not in Santa Fe. It was in Sedona, Arizona, a number of years before. Sedona, as you may know if you've been there,
I have been there.
It's a very spiritual place.
Yes.
And they also, I'm very sensitive to all kinds of things, spiritual things and metaphysical things. And somebody told me before I went to Sedona, they said, now, be aware that because of all the vortexes that they have there, which are very powerful magnetic forces, that you may be feeling things that you've never felt before. And indeed, within the first few hours of when I got there, I started crying my eyes out. It was very bizarre. I had never experienced anything like that, and I just couldn't stop crying. And so I asked the woman who ran the B&B where we were staying, I said, what am I supposed to do about this? And she suggested that I take a vision quest. So she found me someone who could be my guide, and my husband and I went up into the hills of Sedona on this vision quest. And there was a lot of drumming and chanting and all of this kind of thing that made me, my heart starts pounding when I think about it. It was just so dramatic. And the guy who was our guide I don't remember what tribe he was, but he was a Native American. And he had this long, long black hair and very gentle soul. And of course, there was a lot more crying going on. And at the end of the vision quest, he gave me a big hug, which, at that point, that was a point in my life before people started doing the kind of hugging that they do now. Now it's pretty much normal. Back then it wasn't so much, and my husband was quite taken aback by it. But it felt so wonderful because it opened up my mind and my heart and my soul, and it's something that I'd always remembered. So I used that as the basis for Julia's vision quest in Santa Fe.
It sounded wonderful in the book, and the story sounds even better.
Yes, very moving. Now, Julia, your amateur sleuth and violinist, is described by her significant other, Larry, a New York Police Department detective. He describes her as strong-willed, Jewish, beautiful, and smart. Taking you on has been my most challenging project. So, Erica, can you talk a little about this couple in your book, Julia and Larry?
Oh, I'd love to. First of all, I want to say, though, that this is just to give you a bit of a spoiler alert. For those who haven't yet read Murder in the Pit, I'm going to tell a little bit about how they ended up as a couple. And it first started out in Murder in the Pit as a very confrontational relationship. So as a screenwriter, I've done a lot of studying about romantic comedies and what they call the cute meet, which is when a couple that's destined for each other meets for the first time. And your screenwriting coaches always tell you to think of something that's different and kind of cute and kind of sweet. So this, either that or completely confrontational, and I chose the latter. So when Larry and Julia first meet, they disagree about everything. It's just after the first murder has been committed. He's investigating. She is, for personal reasons, which I don't want to go into too much for those who will read Murder in the Pit, it's a personal thing for her, this murder that's been committed. So she and Larry are at odds with each other for about 1/3 of the book. And then eventually the tide turns when they realize that they can really get a lot out of working with each other instead of against each other. And so eventually they start working together, and the relationship becomes the opposite of confrontational. It becomes cooperational or cooperative. And then it turns out that they resonate a great deal with each other. And I don't want to say too much more, but since you've read Death by Opera, you know that that starts out with them together in every sense of the word. So there it is. It turns out they have a wonderful relationship, but also, even though they're at this point very fond of each other, they're such different personalities because, as you mentioned, she's smart and she's Jewish, and which means that she tends to have her difficult moments, as it were, and he's much more easygoing, and so it's a kind of opposite attracts situation. But the bottom line is they both appreciate their differences, and they appreciate things about each other that keep their relationship very close. And so when anything happens to one or the other of them, the other person is just deeply committed to making sure that they both stay safe.
It is so fascinating, too, between the two books, journeying with these two characters, watching, I mean, the way that you develop them and we get to know them across both books. It's just very well done. They're a fascinating duo.
Well, it's interesting, too, because after I wrote Murder in the Pit, and I was kind of in between books and debating about whether to write a sequel, I met a woman who had like 40 years of experience in publishing in New York, and she said, yes, definitely write a sequel, and make sure you use these two protagonists because they're terrific. I thought, well, that's all I needed to know.
Yeah, they were a very, very, I don't want to say a cute couple, but they were a very cute couple in the book, the way they played off of one another. You had two other interesting characters in the book, ghosts, Julia Staub and John Crosby. What can you tell us about them, and why was there this paranormal element to the book? And maybe that's because I write paranormal that I'm interested in that. But one of my favorite characters was actually John Crosby. Can you talk a little bit more about him?
Yes, I can actually talk about both of those characters, but I'll begin by telling you how I came to be writing about ghosts. Those who have been in Santa Fe probably know that it's well known not only for its spirituality, but I found in my research there are more ghosts supposedly in Santa Fe than anywhere else in the country. So I thought, if there are ghosts, then I need to find more about them. So I researched, and I went online and found out about all of the ghosts that supposedly hang out in Santa Fe. And the most famous one was a woman named Julia Staub. Now, here's the thing. When I read that, my jaw just dropped. I'm like, what are the chances that this ghost has the same name as my protagonist? I have to fit this in. I have to write something about this in the book.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
Fated.
Can you believe? I get goosebumps when I think about it. So I started researching Julia Staub, and I found that there was a book that was written by her actual great-granddaughter, whose name is Hannah Nordhaus. She wrote a book called American Ghosts, and she tells about her own journey going back to both to Germany, where Julia originated, and to Santa Fe, to find out what the real story was about Julia. So that was, it began with that book. And then when I went to Santa Fe, I asked if I could take a tour around La Posada de Santa Fe, which is the inn that was built around Julia's original house, which was built in the 1860s sometime, I think. And so that house, that original house, is still there just as it was built, and then they built this inn around it. Now, it is said that Julia's ghost still walks the hallways of this residence, and people swear that they have seen her. And her original suite of rooms has been made into a kind of don't want to say a shrine, but a place that you can visit and see where she lived. All her stuff is still there, the furniture, there's a portrait of her on the wall. It's really wonderfully creepy. And so
I'll have to go.
You have to go. Not only that, but they have a restaurant, or I should say it's actually a bar, in the inn that's called, quote, Julia, a spirited restaurant and bar, unquote.
Great.
I'll take Melanie.
It's totally wonderfully crazy. Now, the tour guide told me that she has not personally seen Julia's ghost, but she knows people who have. There are a number of theories as to why Julia is still hanging around. Most of them center around the fact that she was very unhappy when they built this reasonably modern inn all around her house. She didn't like that, so she's still hanging around just to make sure everything stays the way it's supposed to be. So she still lives there, quote unquote lives, the word lives. And
Yes.
So I got to see all of these places where she hung out, and I have lots of pictures too that I took, which served as inspiration for that chapter that takes place where Julia and Larry stay there. So, but what was most fascinating and creepy was that the tour guide said, if you look into this mirror, this was a mirror that was hanging over a mantelpiece. She said, look into the mirror and you'll only see your own reflection. But if you take a picture of the mirror, you will see a strange blue light. That is Julia. She said, not everybody who takes a picture sees that light. So it'll be interesting to see if you do. And sure enough, I can show you the pictures that show the blue light. It's really, I mean, how can I not write about this stuff?
Oh my gosh.
So that's Julia. Now, John Crosby, he was such a character. He started this opera company in the middle of the desert, far away from any big city here or any metropolitan area where people actually go to see opera. Everybody said he was crazy, but he made it work. He founded the Santa Fe Opera in 1957 and built it into one of this country's most important opera companies. They say he made opera bloom in the desert. Now, he was such a quirky character that a man by the name of Craig A. Smith wrote a biography of John Crosby called A Vision of Voices. And it came out about, I'd say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in which he describes the character quirks of John Crosby. Now, also, I have a very close friend named David Holloway, who used to run the apprentice program at Santa Fe Opera. Santa Fe Opera has the most prestigious opera apprentice program in the country. So David ran that program for 30 years, and David was, in fact, my main entree into the opera company and the opera house. He introduced me to all the people who gave me tours around, people I interviewed, and they told me all of their frightening stories. So David knew John Crosby very, very well because he himself was an apprentice at Santa Fe Opera when Crosby was there. And all these stories that are in the book are absolutely true, including the one about the soprano who drives the Jeep into the swimming pool. That all stuff actually happened.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was quite crazy in a wonderful way. He was not known for being a very pleasant person or a people person at all. In fact, he tried to avoid contact with people as much as he could. But what he loved were the mountains. He loved his opera house. He loved the gardens. He would be out in the gardens every morning with his, Santa Fe Mexican hat on and his shorts, working in the garden. There was nothing there that he wouldn't do. When the house burned down, the opera house burned down. Actually, it's burned down twice. The first time was in 1967. He was, of course, devastated, but he was the first one who went out there and started motivating people to rebuild. So he was totally committed to it. Now, I recently saw in the Santa Fe New Mexican a picture of John Crosby in his white tie and tails just before a performance he was going to conduct, standing on his head. I mean, that's the kind of thing that he did. He was enigmatic. He succeeded with this project that no one thought would ever happen, and that seemed unimaginably quixotic. That was John Crosby. So, and people swear that they see his ghost as well. So I'm not making that up when I, created his ghost as a character in the book. He's like Julia. He's still around. He wants to make sure that everything stays the way it's supposed to be. And that was John Crosby.
Well, you don't build something and just leave it to the staff.
To the desert.
Yeah, God forbid. No, I mean, yeah, it was his baby. It was absolutely his baby. And it still is.
Wow. Well, you write so well of building tension in your mystery, the plot of murder and investigation building to a crescendo. And just when I think that's it, then you build more. And as a reader, I am at your mercy. I found that the environment that the characters are in has surprising tensions of its own. At one point, one of your characters describes, quote, "I remember when I was preparing to sing Apollo in Daphne, a tough role. It felt fine working on it, but when I got out there and started to struggle, I thought, what's going to happen here? Then something came over me, and suddenly I was in total control. I surprised myself how well I sang. Moments like that, for a performer, they happen without necessarily knowing how they happen." And that's the end of the character's quote. But Erica, what are the opportunities as an author when writing a life and death struggle that's against this magical background of opera? And then besides the opportunities in that, also, what are the challenges?
Well, let me start by saying that old cliche, write what you know. The thing about cliches is there's usually a lot of truth in them. And there is indeed magic in opera and in opera's setting. I believe it's the truest form of art imitating life. And so how perfect is that? To write about and to create a plot and characters who revolve around an opera house. It seems perfect for me. Now, as far as the life and death struggle and the magical background, well, it is magical. Everything about opera is magical. And yet it's also so truthful. These dramas and these comedies are so true to life and the characters in them. To be able to write these books, especially Death by Opera, because, well, I was at the Met for 21 years, so I knew the place inside out, but I didn't know Santa Fe that well. So when I went there, I interviewed many, many, many singers and got reams and reams of material of stories they told me about their performances, about their communications with John Crosby, all of that. That's a great opportunity to be able to write about that, create characters who are fictional and yet are telling the truth and performing the truth about this art form called the opera. Now, my 21 years at the Met showed me what the dangers of opera could be, and the dangers of working in a theater. And I actually give lectures on this sort of thing. It's really a challenge to work in a place like that. Stuff happens. really bad stuff can happen, dangerous stuff can happen. Lots of stories that I haven't yet put in my books. So it's a challenge to make that seem real, but yet not too real. One of my screenwriting teachers told me, don't put too much of yourself in your story. So I created a character who's very much a reflection about me, a reflection of what my experiences were as a young violinist there. But I also tried to create her in a way that she's not just a carbon copy of me. And that is a huge challenge, because whenever I think of opera, I think of my own experiences there.
Yes.
Also, it's a big challenge to make the atmosphere realistic. I've had reactions from people who say, oh, that couldn't possibly happen, or you can't see the stage from the pit of the Met Opera. Well, you know, I wish I could talk to the person and say, when was the last time you sat in that pit? Because we can see almost everything that's going on there. Of course, you're not supposed to be looking most of the time, but when you play La Boheme 200 times, you pretty much know the music well enough so you can be looking at the stage. Everybody does it, but you didn't hear that from me.
I won't tell.
That's our secret.
Yeah, not for long. But a lot of people don't believe that kind of thing can happen at an opera house. And in fact, a lot of the worst things that I saw happen, I wouldn't dare put in the book. That's how bad they are. So what actually happens there can be even more extreme than what I portrayed. I kind of had to hold back a little bit for a lot of that. So as I said, art imitates life, and the art of opera imitates what goes on with quote unquote real people. And so that's a huge challenge. All of that, to portray that in a way that at least most readers will believe. And people who love opera and people who love mysteries, both, for the most part, have found that I succeeded pretty well in reaching that goal.
I thought you achieved that goal fabulously. Just keeping on the topic of tension, you added additional tension to the story by having several very challenging scores that Julia needed to master for this season at the Opera House, while cast members are dropping off all around her. I was just wondering, was that an actual summer program from the Santa Fe Opera House with those three operas, or did you take a bit of license and pick three of your favorites that kind of blended together a little bit?
It's a little bit of both, actually. I researched a great deal about the history of Santa Fe Opera, and I researched the operas that have actually been performed there, made very long lists of one kind or another. And so what I did was I took that list of operas that I knew had been performed there, and then I chose the ones that were the most violent and bloody. I created my own season as if I were an impresario. How great is that?
It was lovely.
Nice.
It was really fun, because then I got to imagine the kinds of things that could go wrong. And I also spoke with an actual, because for Romeo and Juliet, there's, of course, a big sword fight. And I spoke with the fight director, and I found out how that kind of stuff, how they prepare that kind of stuff. It's wonderful. But those operas, and I have also played all of them at the Met, so I knew them all very well. And I just wanted to make sure that I could create something fictional out of that was steeped in reality and the real world of opera. But my main criterion was the most violent and bloody, which would be the perfect background for what's happening in this book.
Yes, it was.
Well, and what a wonderful cast of characters for the readers to choose from for Suspects. The backstage, for example, is filled with costume designers, hairdressers, stagehands, and so on. One of my favorites in the supporting cast is Sándor, who emigrated from Hungary. on the surface, he seems like such a nice guy. And then I keep thinking as I read about all those people in real life who are interviewed on the news about a neighborhood killer, and they say, oh, he was such a nice guy. Can you talk a little about what inspired you to create one of my favorite suspects, Shandor? And do you have a favorite among all of your suspects?
Well, I'll tell you something. I have found in writing both screenplays and novels about in the mystery genre that the first thing you need to know is who is your killer. So I have to say that the killer in this particular, in Death by Opera, is one of my favorite characters. But of course, I'm not going to tell the audience who that is. Shandor specifically actually was partially based on pretty much every tenor I've ever known, the everyman tenor, as it were, but also his personality and his name are inspired by one of my favorite violinist colleagues at the Met of the same name, although we called him Sandy. He was just such a lovely guy. I really, really loved him and admired everything that he did. He was not only a great violin player, but he also led the orchestra committee and helped us through a lot of hard times. So I had him in mind when I created the character of Shandor, even though Shandor is a tenor. That's what I feel is important to do, is if I base a character on someone I know, I then embroider and embellish and make that person into a character who's really either a combination of people I know or somebody quite different from the actual person. But he had a very colorful personality. Now, I have a European background. My parents came from Russia. And so I love creating characters from other countries because, after all, an opera house is like an international melting pot. Multiple languages are spoken. People come from all over the world, and this adds to the color and the flavor of the story. So that's why I always have, and as you will hear in the excerpt that I'm going to read, a number of characters from different countries, especially European countries. These days, actually, there are more and more Asian singers who come to sing on the opera stage. But I think that's very important because, after all, it's an international, opera is an international endeavor. People come from all over the world to perform at the Met, of course, and other opera houses. And I think it's always important to me to have a few international prominent characters in my stories, besides which, as far as Shandor being Hungarian, that little subplot about Julia's aunt, I actually did have an aunt who was Hungarian. So all of this kind of combines and becomes part of the story. Also, the Met and Santa Fe Opera, and especially San Francisco Opera, San Francisco being probably the most cosmopolitan city in our country, they all have the most fascinating, colorful histories. And so I just find that when you put it all together, you get wonderful characters in this very rich atmosphere, and then you get to do terrible things to them. I mean, what could be better?
Speaking of doing terrible things to people, I loved how you were able to write some incredibly bloody deaths in this book without turning it into a gore fest. Could you give us some tips on how to build that kind of tension and how to really really stress how violently someone was killed without spraying blood from the rafters?
Well, funny you should ask. I've never been a fan of gore. I have never gotten all the way through a Stephen King novel. I just I don't have the stomach for it, which is ironic since I'm writing murder mysteries. But I always try to downplay that aspect in my writing. I rather build tension psychological by getting into the heads of the characters, creating tension from their personalities and the conflicts between them. In addition, the backstory of the killer. A killer is not born. A killer develops over a lifetime or part of a lifetime. And the interesting thing is to delve into the reasons why that person becomes a killer, why that person suddenly snaps and goes after a person or more than one person. All of this, I think, can be build much more tension than describing a lot of gory, bloody scenes.
I agree.
And when you think about it, that kind of graphic gore really takes place on stage in the opera. Any number of operas, countless the operas, you'll see these terrible things happening, murders and battles that are bloody, all of this kind of stuff. The violence in the plot of my books parallels the violence on stage, so that I don't feel that I have to get really bloody about it. And that's what I do. It's more psychological. And sometimes just the anticipation of something terrible happening is worse than the actual happening itself.
If done well, it is. And you did.
Hopefully.
Well, Stella and Constantine are the law enforcement people investigating the murder. They come across as like fish out of water in the world of opera. As they explore and learn about this very different world, as a reader, so did I. So what was your inspiration for creating these two characters, and what is it that you most like about them?
Well, for Stella, who is the main detective, after having two male detectives in Murder in the Pit, I thought, how interesting would it be to have a female detective? As it happened, before I moved here, I lived in San Diego for many years, so I still have a lot of friends there, some of whom were big fans of Murder in the Pit. And one of them, I sat down with her one day and she said, could you please base a character on me? And I'm like, well, that's a great idea. I had to think about which character it was going to be, and then I realized she would be perfect for the detective. Different name, but I actually gave her a last name. The last name is Peregrine, because my friend in real life is crazy about birds. She studies birds and she works with birds at the San Diego Zoo and all this kind of stuff. I thought, okay, I'll give her the name Peregrine. So as far as her passion for Shakespeare, that kind of happened out of the blue when circumstances started bringing up these Shakespearean quotes in my head, and I'm like, well, why not make her a Shakespeare buff?
I loved that part too. They would just pop out so almost naturally for that character. It was just so cool.
It was cool.
I also, what I like about Stella as a character is her aggressiveness. As a female detective, it's like in the world of music, up until a few years ago, as a female musician, they used to say that you had to play twice as well as any of the men in order to get a position in an orchestra. That has changed since they've been using screens for auditions. You have to audition behind a screen. That changed radically, interestingly.
Oh.
But I felt that in her position, it's basically mostly a male world. She had to be aggressive. She had to be tough. And I thought, I loved being able to create a character who was really tough and smart and yet had this this little thing for Shakespeare. As far as Constantine, I got the name from a former Met colleague, but Constantine in the book is nothing like that character. I see him basically as the underdog. He is so much less, he's hardly aggressive at all. He's just a really nice guy who's struggling to understand this different world and kind of, at some points, caving from it. Also trying to keep pace with Stella, who's so energetic. So I wanted to create this huge contrast. between the two of them and show how they could balance each other out and work well together. And it turned out that they're both really, I think, very sympathetic characters. And especially the scenes that Stella has with Julia. I mean, Julia being this sensitive, almost hothouse flower, and Stella being this rough and tough, aggressive female cop. And the two of them have these kind of sweet scenes together, which I really enjoyed creating. So, that was the inspiration for those characters. Again, they say, write what you know. Interestingly, this friend of mine, I saw her last time in San Diego. She's like, "Can you bring Stella back in the next book?" I have to think about that one.
Nice. Well, actually, my fingers are crossed as I ask you, Erica, is a third book in your mystery series coming in the future? And if so, can you tell us what opera house will be the new setting?
The answer is yes.
Ah!
2/3 through the next sequel, which is set at San Francisco Opera.
Oh, yes.
It takes Julia even further from home.
Yes.
Now, as it happens, I have a lot of friends in the company, and I've done a number of research trips there already, and I've gotten great cooperation from the company members and from the staff and various other people who have taken me on tours from top to bottom of the opera house. They've given me access to the archives. I've already, of course, before I even start writing, I also like to make sure that all my research is in place, that I've taken all my notes. And what I found about San Francisco Opera is it has one of the most colorful histories of any opera company ever. It's steeped in the California gold rush. That's when opera started in San Francisco, actually, with the so-called opera halls, as they were, that started out really as drinking places. And then eventually the gold miners started making all this money and didn't know what to do with it there. So they started building these opera houses with entertainment that wasn't originally opera. So they had something to spend their money on besides brothels and bars. But then word started getting out that there was money there. And so people started coming over from Europe, from Italy and from Germany and from France, to start their own opera companies there, and voila, there you have a city that is absolutely opera crazy in the best sense of the word. So I thought, San Francisco, here we come.
Wonderful.
Yes, I've visited San Francisco a number of times. I love the city, and it also is fairly unique. Erica, I was hoping that you would treat us and our listeners to reading some passages from Death by Opera.
Well, of course. You couldn't stop me if you tried.
Wouldn't try.
I have a passage here that I've chosen, but as a prelude to it, I need give you a little bit of introduction to the characters so you'll know who's doing what and why. Before I start the read. Of course, in an opera, there's always lots of characters, so it gets confusing. So I just wanted to explain that right off the bat. So the opera, this is during a rehearsal of the opera. It's called Lulu. And the reason I chose Lulu is that it's a kind of a mid-20th century opera. Very dissonant, not easy listening by any means, and also really crazily violent. Actually, Jack the Ripper is a character in this opera. So I chose it for its violence. So the characters in this scene are Salman, who is the stage director, Emilia, who is the classic Italian diva lead soprano, Guran, who is the baritone, who always tries to placate everybody who Emilia is pissing off, Julia, of course, who's the protagonist. She has been invited to be concertmaster for the summer at Santa Fe on break from the Met. Matt is her assistant concertmaster, the violinist that sits next to her. Marin is Julia's friend, who's a mezzo-soprano who's always at odds with Emilia. Stuart is the British conductor, high and mighty and uppity. And then we have mention of dear old John Crosby. So that's, I'm sure you haven't gotten that straight, but hopefully as I read, you'll be able to picture all these people. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yes, I am.
As Marin seated herself, Emilia flashed a hostile glance in Marin's direction and stage whispered to Goran, "She sings too loud, always tries to upstage me." Marin frowned. "I heard that, Emilia. In case you've forgotten, in this opera I'm your lesbian lover. Try to be a little kinder, would you?" Salmon suppressed a groan. "Let's just sing, shall we?" Goran and Emilia huddled together as Marin watched. "Wer ist das?" "Who is that?" Goran sang. "Meine Schwester," "my sister," Emilia replied. "Das ist nicht deine Schwester. Sie ist in dich verliebt." "That's not your sister. She is your lover." "You could have fooled me," Marin muttered under her breath. Emilia extricated herself from Goran and faced Marin, fuming. "What did you say?" She turned to Salman. "You see, she is sabotaging me." "Could we continue, please?" Salman pleaded. Lulu and Jack off stage for the final dialogue. Emilia's nostrils flared, but she allowed Goran to shepherd her off into the weeds. Then came Emilia's blood-curdling cry. "Nein, nein! No, no! Lulu, mein Engel! Lulu, my angel!" Marin cried in anguish. She rushed off stage, then returned, slowly backing up, eyes wide in horror, as Goran stalked on stage toward her, wielding an oversized stage knife, which he plunged into her. Having murdered 2 women, Goran sang, "Ich bin doch ein verdammter Glücksspiels. I am just the damned luckiest of men." Then, seizing a bottle of wine from a table, he washed off the knife with the wine and wiped the knife on his coat. Salman was ecstatic. "Excellent, excellent." Julia watched, horrified, as the bloody violence unfolded on stage. She knew the singers were just acting and the scenario was only make-believe, but the sheer awfulness of the bloody violence was so realistically portrayed she couldn't keep her jaw from dropping. "Pretty heavy duty, isn't it?" Matt asked. "I just can't take my eyes off the action," she said. But seeing the conductor Stewart's disapproving glare, she tore her eyes away from the stage and back to the music before her. Meanwhile, Emilia had come back to life and strode onto the stage to confront Salman. "It is not most effective staging. Murder must be on stage." Salman finally lost his patience. "It's the way John Crosby conceived," he growled. "Take it up with him." "But John Crosby is dead." "Precisely," said Salman. "Oh," cried Emilia, her expression outraged. "You are bisquero, idiot." Fuming, she marched off stage. "That attitude will make you even more enemies than you already have, Emilia," Salman shouted after her.
Oh, thank you so much. I loved that scene when I read it too. It's amazing.
I'm hooked again.
Interaction. I know, right? I'm thinking about reading it again myself.
How much that I can't tell.
Yeah. So I love classical music, symphonic music. I've never really listened to opera, but I'm intrigued to try some out since reading your book in my copious minutes of free time that I have in my life. I want to thank you for your reading and for participating with us tonight. I really appreciate it. Wendy?
Yes, Erica, thank you so much. It's so fascinating to hear the stories and the inspiration and everything behind the novels. So thank you so much for joining us for a novel talk.
Well, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate your featuring me on the podcast so that I could share my passion about books and writing, and especially opera. And I hope my operatic mystery series will inspire people's interest in opera as well. So thank you both.
Oh, beautiful. Well, your books are highly recommended, and your mysteries are certainly puzzles that are irresistible, begging to be investigated and solved. And just a quick hint to listeners, with our recording date, there's still time to treat someone on your holiday gift-giving list to this reading adventure. But before we say goodbye, I wanted to encourage our listeners to visit your website at ericaminer.com with all kinds of information about your very active writings and a view of all your books, reviews, speaking engagements, and more. Listeners will also want to sign up for your fun newsletter. And a thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and keep reading, because a novel read leads to a novel talk.